Alright, since it's the day of, I want to make a quick refresher video about Yule, Old Norse Yule, and specifically I want to consider a few questions about when it really is. I have a much older video about the practices that are written about in medieval Icelandic sagas as being practiced on Yule. The problem that we're always going to have with sources about pre-Christian practice written down in Old Norse in the 1200s and 1300s, the period when we get this flourishing of Icelandic literature about pre-Christian times, is that they're being written down by people who don't practice the religion and they're not interested in teaching anybody else how to practice it. Also, they don't know anyone who practices it. So any information that they have has been passed down in an oral game of telephone for a long time. Now, some of that oral game of telephone is reflected in skaldic poetry, which is so strict that anything mentioned about Yule or anything else in skaldic poetry, we can actually, as long as we have something to date the poem by, linguistic features, poetic features, we can actually sometimes say, well, then this we can confidently date to the Viking Age. But even then, we really don't have very much mentioned about Yule in skaldic poems. Odin is called Yulnir, apparently something like the Yule doer, the practicer of Yule. That doesn't tell us much, because what is it to do Yule, to practice Yule? We read about the verb that's usually associated with Yule in the oldest sources is drekka Yule, to drink Yule. So apparently there is some kind of ritual drinking, although that's not surprising in a culture that sort of drinks at every occasion anyway and considers the act of drinking somewhat sacral. The dating of it to the winter solstice is also not for certain. Snorri Sturluson, in the saga of Håkon the Good, in his Heimskringla, The Lives of the Kings of Norway, says, and I'm just going to translate this off the fly, he, Håkon the Good, put it into the laws that one should hold Yule at the same time as Christians, and then every man should have a particular measurement of ale, and he should pay money otherwise, so there's a fee if you don't drink a certain amount apparently, and et cetera, et cetera. But earlier, but before that, Yule was held at hۆkunótt. That was the midwinter night, and it was and Yule was held for 3 nights. Yule is a plural word, so maybe it refers to 3 nights of drinking. Hۆkunótt looks like chin night. It's a hotbox. It's a word that we only have attested one time, this very place. So we actually don't know what that's about. Is it chin night or is it something else? And what does midwinter night mean? The first thing, the natural thing that I think that modern audiences, including myself, want to read out of that is that it's the winter solstice, right? It's the shortest day of the year. That's often what people call midwinter night today, even though that's a little bit of a contradiction because we also consider that the beginning of winter in astronomical terms. But traditionally in Iceland, midwinter night is not the winter solstice. It's the first night of Thori, which is one of the traditional pre-Julian or Gregorian calendar months celebrated in Iceland. By the way, its name means drying. It's not actually related to Thor, which is one long O and so it's 2 R's, but the root is only 1 R. So it's not related to Thor, although later popular culture has identified it with him. At any rate, Thori is the month that corresponds to the moon that is up from January to February. Remember that months in a pre-Julian or Gregorian calendar system are what they etymologically are associated with their moons, right? So it might be that it's associated with the winter solstice, but it might actually have something to do with the first moon, whether you consider that the full moon or the new moon that comes after the winter solstice. It's not for certain that this holiday was held on the winter solstice. In that older video, I went through a lot of the rituals that are talked about, and especially like the Snorri Sturluson's Heimskringla. You know, how much we can know about how much of that is real is hard to say. There's talk about sacrifice of animals, eating sacrificial animals. There's talks about drinking toasts to gods and to the dead. All of that is possibly part of the ritual, possibly not part of the ritual, and of course the ritual probably varied a lot from place to place, time to time. But one feature that is strongly identified with Yule in the sagas is the swearing of oaths. So for example, in the saga of Hervor and Haethrak, which I translated in my fourth book, Two Sagas of Mythical Heroes, we have an oath that's sworn early on in that saga, being a major plot point that gets the action of the saga moving along. A man swears that he's going to marry a particular woman. This actually seems to be a particular theme to oaths sworn on Yule, because something similar comes up in the Poetic Edda, translated in my first book, the poem Helge Kvile Hjorvarthsonar, where Helge's brother Hethin swears that he'll marry Helge's beloved Sigrun. No, it's Svava in that version of the Helge poem. Anyway, he later regrets it, but because he swore it on Yule, and because they believe that oaths are kind of ironclad anyway, he has to either remove himself completely from their presence, which is what he does, or try to fulfill his oath. So apparently an oath sworn on Yule is particularly strong, which might remind us more than anything else of New Year's resolutions, right? The Norse never talk very specifically about dates. This is part of why I find something like the Kensington Runestone really laughable, because it is a very specific date that's understandable to a modern audience. But it's not unreasonable that, like many other cultures around the world, the new year might be held to start at the winter solstice, or again, potentially the first moon, whatever that means, after the winter solstice. A time of renewal and a time of resetting and a time of making promises about the time that's coming ahead. I read an interesting summary of the information available about Yule in pre-Christian times that's actually published on heimskringla.no, which is also a place where I often go to access the texts of Norse literature when I need just a quick look at something. The texts aren't edited in modern times. They're just OCR, public domain text, but it gives me something to search. Anyway, they also have some original articles, and I have one by Sophie Binding, Dr. Sophie Binding, about pre-Christian Yule. It's in Danish, but if you can read Danish, or if you want to deal with the vicissitudes of Google Translate, you can check that out. It has just a really good summary of the information that is available to us. And again, I do have an older video on the subject that gets into some of the rituals that are discussed in places like Snorri Sturluson's Heimskringla. For now, I'm hoping that you all have delightful winter holidays, whatever fashion and date you celebrate them in. And from beautiful Colorado, I'm wishing you all the best.
And what is your solstice oath?
What's yours?
I think I'm going to create more and consume less.
I think it's a good one. I think I'm going to try to remember that whatever the other circumstances of life, we've had some hard days lately, what a priceless gift you are, and to show gratitude for having you in my life and everything that I do.
I like that one.
What's your solstice oath out there, folks?